For people trying to become a baseball fan, looking at a stat page that looks like this can be a little intimidating. Something like XWOBACON is a real stat that you are expected to know if you want to understand everything there is to know about baseball. However, not every single statistic is that important, and instead of trying to figure out what these borderline useless stats mean, let me explain what stats I use to make videos like this one and this one. And if I can make these videos based off of these stats, you can win any argument and beat your friends with your new baseball knowledge. So make sure you watch until the end to really get the full picture. To start understanding your stats, you need to know first where to find the stats. There are 3 websites that are the best ways to find stats, in my opinion, and these are Baseball Reference, Baseball Savant, and Fangraphs. A one-word summary for each of these sites in order are simple, overall, and advanced. Baseball Reference is going to give you the easiest to understand and the simplest stats available. It's a great baseline if you want a fast way to know how good a player is. Baseball Savant has a bit of literally everything. You can spend an hour looking at a single player's Baseball Savant page and still not have seen everything. And Fangraphs is for those advanced fans who want to see how good a player is versus left-handed hitting, or on a Friday, or basically anything else you could possibly think of. With that being said, the best way to really understand a full picture, of course, is by looking at all 3 of these pages and gathering certain stats from the players you're interested in. Let's start looking at those stats that actually matter. But before I do that, subscribe if you have not yet. Less than 3% of my viewers are subscribed to the channel, and it's so simple to do so. Also, if you have any questions about specific stats, let me know. I'll make sure to respond to every comment on this video. First off, let's start with some simple stats you should look at and some that you should avoid for pitchers. To start, we should look at Baseball Reference's page because it's, again, the easiest set of stats to understand. Pitching stats can be difficult because so much of it involves sample size. Any major leaguer is going to be dominant throughout 3-game stretches. It's whether you can do it for 10 to 15 games where it really starts to matter. This is why sometimes percentage stats are better than counting stats. Counting stats are how many of something a player has, like home runs or runs batted in. Percentage stats are how often something happens. So if player A hits 20 homers but he did so in 400 at-bats, and player B hit 10 home runs but did it in 100 at-bats, if you only look at counting stats, you'll think player A has been more powerful. But if you look at percentage stats, player B has homered twice as often. Just keep this in mind as we go through the certain stats. Now, let's start with a bad stat to look at, and that is pitchers' wins and losses. Throw it away immediately. Just get rid of it. If you use it, your argument is already discredited. And why is that? In 2018, Jacob deGrom had one of the greatest pitching seasons of recent memory, with a 1.7 earned run average, meaning for every 9 innings pitched, he allowed just 1.7 runs. It should be enough to win, right? Especially when you consider the fact that the New York Mets, who was the team that deGrom pitched for, averaged 4.17 runs per game, which was around 2.5 times more than deGrom averaged on the season. He should have had an insane win record, right? No, he did not. deGrom went just 10-9 on that season, and that's because throughout the 2018 season and into the 2019 season, deGrom had the single lowest runs scored in support of him out of any qualified pitcher in baseball, meaning the Mets scored less runs when he was pitching than any other team in baseball did with any other pitcher on the mound. However, if you just looked at the wins and loss record, you would have been told that deGrom had a pretty poor season. However, Jacob deGrom was actually incredible that season, and he finished that season winning the Cy Young with 29 out of 30 first place votes. This is why it's extremely important to look at more than one stat when trying to determine values. For pitchers especially, percentages are more important than counting stats, apart from one, and that is innings pitched. With pitchers being so injured, if a pitcher can give you innings year after year, That's maybe the most important thing they can do for the team. For example, Jordan Lyles, who is basically never injured and has made $50 million over his career, even though he's been a negative player throughout it. That's how important it is to throw innings right now. With that being said, here are the pitching percentage stats that are most important to me: ERA, FIP or fielding independent pitching, ERA plus, WHIP, and the per nines. Starting out with the per nines, these are walks per 9 innings pitched, strikeouts per 9 innings pitched, and home runs allowed per 9 innings pitched. The lower the better for hits and walks, but the higher the better for strikeouts. These stats are best to compare pitchers to one another. ERA I already went over earlier. That's how many earned runs are allowed per 9 innings pitched. If you give up 4 runs in 18 innings, your ERA is 4.5 because you divide 18 by 4 to get the ERA. FIP is basically ERA, but it has a little less luck involved. It removes every outcome that is not a home run, walk, hit by pitch, or strikeout, because those are considered true outcome at bats. And that's because they are always the same thing. If you hit a home run, it's a home run. But sometimes you can hit a ground ball up the middle and someone is standing there, and sometimes you can hit the same ball and no one's there and you get a base hit. That's where FIP is different from ERA. With that being said, if a team has bad defense, your pitcher's FIP is probably going to be better than ERA because it removes the unlucky bad defense. Now, WHIP sounds like FIP, but it's pretty different. It stands for walks and hits allowed per innings pitched. So basically, this just lets you know how many base runners are getting on per inning against the pitcher. So if a pitcher's WHIP is 1.5, that means every 2 innings, 3 base runners are gonna get on base. And finally, ERA plus, which is extremely similar to ERA, but it adjusts for certain factors and makes it easier to compare different eras of baseball. Some of those factors are times played and run environment, which is basically just the stadium that you play at. It's kind of hard to understand. It doesn't really matter, but if you want to compare Nolan Ryan to Jacob deGrom, ERA plus is probably going to be your best way to do that because it accounts for how good the era is that the players are playing. It just kind of gives you a little more information than the regular ERA would. And for plus stats like ERA plus, 100 is always league average. Anything above is good and anything below is bad. This stat basically puts pitchers on an even playing field and makes it fair to all pitchers. Just another interesting way to compare them. Moving on to offense, counting stats are much more important on this side of the ball compared to pitching. However, percentage stats are still just as valuable. The stats I look at here are batting average, on base percentage, OPS, OPS plus, stolen bases on occasion, and home runs. Honestly, with offense, looking at just about every stat is valuable. But these are my go-to. Stolen bases, or SB, are just stolen bases. If you're looking at a fast player like Mike Trout, this can be important. But if you're looking at someone like Yordan Alvarez, who is not a speed player, it's not an issue if he doesn't have stolen bases. Home runs are the only other percentage stat that I look at mostly, and of course, this is how many home runs you hit. Home runs are important and fun. If you hit them, you add a lot of value to a team. This is why Joey Gallo is still on a roster. Now, the least important of the remaining 3 stats is batting average, even though it's still a nice stat to check out because it's really simple. Batting average is how often you get a hit. If you get a hit 4 out of every 10 at-bats, you have a 400 batting average. This just isn't super important, however, because it doesn't factor in walks or getting extra base hits like doubles, triples, or homers, which are more valuable than singles. This is where a better stat, on base percentage, comes into play. OBP is basically the same thing as batting average, except it also gives you credit for walking, which a walk is the same amount of bases as a single and is almost equally as important. So it should be factored in, which is why on base is more valuable. And again, if you look at a player like Kyle Schwarber, because he walks so much, his on-base percentage is good, even if his batting average is horrible every single year. This is similar with Joey Gallo, and again, it's why players like this are able to stay in the league, because on-base percentage is important. The final 2 stats are OPS and OPS plus, which stands for on-base plus slugging, which adds together your on-base percentage and slugging percentage. Slugging percentage is basically how often your hits are extra base hits. I don't really look at this on its own, I just factor it in with OPS because it's more valuable like that in my opinion. For a basic stat, OPS is the most dynamic basic stat that there is. It tells you how often you are getting on base and how often you are driving the ball for power, combined into one stat. The top of the OPS leaderboard are always the best players in baseball, which cannot be said for other regular stats like batting average, doubles, or even home runs. This is why OPS is my go-to basic hitting stat on Baseball Reference. Along with that, there is OPS Plus, which is basically the same thing but easier to compare quickly. Like it was with ERA Plus, the league average is 100 all the time, so if someone has a 160 OPS Plus, that means their hitting is 60% better than the average Major League Baseball hitter. Now, let's move on to one stat that is extremely confusing that both pitchers and hitters are tracked by, and that is wins above replacement, or WAR. WAR is confusing because I don't even know how it's calculated. However, what I do know is the absolute best stat to look at when trying to quickly determine how good a player is WAR. To put it the simplest possible way, however much WAR you have is however many wins you've contributed to your team over an average baseball player. If you have a 0 WAR on the season, congratulations, you have been the most average player in baseball. If you have 8 WAR, that means that the player is worth 8 wins more than the average player at his position. This is like OPS, and it always has the best players at the top of the leaderboard because it's extremely hard to accidentally get a good WAR, because everything is accounted for here. Defense, hitting, pitching, base running, literally everything. The best players in baseball have good WARs, that's just how it works. This stat is also on Baseball Reference, it's easy to see, but there are 2 different types of it. Baseball Reference WAR, or BWAR, values hitting a little bit more than defense, and Fangraphs WAR values FIP for pitchers instead of ERA, and it also values fielding a little bit more for position players. It's a little confusing. I look at BWAR more. A lot of the big baseball nerds look at FWAR more. I personally use BWAR more because it usually fits my narrative better. That's why I use that one. Enough basic stats. Let's move on to some of those fancy analytics that every single MLB manager and baseball nerd swears by now. And let's move over to the Baseball Savant page. Before we get started with Baseball Savant, I need to give you one simple key. Red is good, blue is bad. If you know that, you can quickly look at entire pages and understand things fast. Like Shohei Ohtani is good at baseball and Tim Anderson is bad at baseball. So far, this is checking out correctly. At the very top of the page, we have an overall for each of the 3 aspects for position players, which are batting, base running, and fielding. These are all combined stats, so if you look at hitting, it's the best overall hitters. 100 percentile means you are in the top 1% of all players. If you are 1%, that means you are very bad in that stat and you are in the bottom 1% of the league in that stat. So for Juan Soto, he's a top 1% hitter, less than average base runner, and a top 20% fielder. Now, if you look at fielding at the bottom of the screen, you can see that he has slightly above average range, which is measured by outs above average, or OAA, which just means how often you get to a ball that an average player wouldn't. However, Soto had a top 1% arm value, even if his arm strength is pretty much average. So his overall fielding goes way up because of that arm value stat. However, for defense, I value outs above average much more than the overall value, because range just matters more than arm. It comes into play way more, and personally, I think speed is more important than arm. A player like Jarren Duran does not have a great arm, however, they are an elite fielder because of their outs above average and their speed, which makes them be able to get to everything. But personally, I value the eye test much more than fielding stats, because some players are obviously just good defenders, even if their fielding stats might not say it. A perfect example of this is Red Sox rookie Cedane Rafaela. who is a freak of nature defender, but outs above average says that he's really bad. Sometimes the eye test is more important for defense than any stat. If these players are making insane plays on a daily basis, they're gonna be a good defender, especially if they're a rookie like Savant. He's gonna win gold gloves, but right now it says he's bad. If you watch enough baseball, you know who's good defenders and who aren't just by watching. The same cannot always be said about hitters and pitchers, although it kind of can, but even less so with fielding. Base running doesn't really matter compared to hitting and fielding. Obviously, it can give you some extra benefits, and if you're a stolen base guy, you can turn a single into a double and a double into a triple. So a person like Elly De La Cruz just getting stolen bases and being so fast and aggressive on the base path can help a team, but it just doesn't matter as much as hitting and fielding does. Now, hitting stats is where it starts to get tough to understand, because there's about 5 times more of them than the fielding stats, and some of which are more important than others, although they're all pretty important for this initial breakdown up top. Mostly the top 9 are all pretty similar. They're basically, how is your quality of contact? Something that we were not mentioning on Baseball Reference is quality of contact, which is extremely important, and I'll get into a little bit more in a minute. But first, the first 3 are all expected stats, and those basically mean how likely you are to get a base hit off of the quality of contact you make. Not all contact is created equal, and these stats take that all into account. They are calculated by how often the launch angle and exit velocity of a swing turns into a base hit or an extra base hit in the case of expected slugging. Now, launch angle is the angle at which the ball flies off the bat initially. You're aiming for around 15 to 25-ish most of the time for launch angles. Those are generally the best launch angles. And exit velocity is just how hard the ball flies off of the bat initially. A higher exit velocity is extremely important. The best hitters in baseball have high exit velocities, unless you're a singles guy like Luis Ariz. These are good stats to look at because if someone's batting average is really low, but they're making really solid contact, these stats will be able to show that. And you can project that they'll definitely improve in the future because they are making good swings. Baseball is hard because sometimes you can hit a weak little blooper and it can be a game-winning walk-off double, and other times you can perfectly square up a ball and it dies at the warning track. That's just the way the sport works. Next up, we have 3 stats that are very similar. They are basically about how hard you hit the ball, and this has a direct correlation with how often you are going to get on base. The harder you hit a ball, the likelihood of you getting on base goes way up. On Baseball Savant, you can actually see the batting average on each batted ball at each exit velocity. For example, the batting average on batted balls with an exit velocity of 109 miles per hour is 673, which obviously is ridiculously high for a batting average. However, if you hit the ball with an exit velocity of 88 miles per hour, which is 20 miles per hour lower, your batting average drops all the way down to 194. That's over 3 times more likely with the 20 miles per hour higher exit velocity, and this is fairly consistent throughout all exit velocities. Of course, 107 might be higher than 108 and 106 might be lower than 107. It's hard, it's never going to be perfect, but generally speaking, the harder you hit the baseball, the more likely you are to get a hit because it's harder to get to. It's better contact, and it's just important to hit the ball hard. That's why looking at things like average exit velocity, barrel percent, and sweet spot are important because it can really give you important information that helps you out that the base numbers can't really calculate. And again, that's the exit velocities. Average exit velocity is what your average exit velocity is. What it is what it is. Barrel percentage is how often you're barreling up the baseball, so that's basically hitting it hard and hitting it on the good part of the bat. And sweet spot, which is essentially the same thing as barrel percent, it's just how often you're hitting it on the sweet spot of the bat. Pretty much the same thing as barrel percent. I look at them interchangeably. The final 4 stats on this page are how often they swing and miss or walk, with chase rate being how often they swing outside of the strike zone, whiff rate being how often they swing and miss on balls inside of the strike zone, K rate being the amount that they strike out, and BB percent, which is the amount they walk, because BB stands for base on balls, if you didn't know. Again, for all of these stats, the higher the number, the better, with 100 being the best and 100 being the worst. Savant gives you tons of other information as well, such as how hitters perform against certain types of pitches and what type of batted balls hitters get, like line drives, pop-ups, and ground balls. You can also see an overall heat map, which is very fun to see because you can see when there's a baseball like 400 feet further than any other one, you know that they hit an absolute nuke, and you can go back throughout their years to compare the players throughout 2018, 2019, 2022, and 2024 if that's what you're interested in. With pitcher stats on Savant, it's extremely similar to hitters. If you understand the hitting stats, it's basically the same thing with pitcher stats, it's just for the pitchers instead of the hitters. However, there are a few cool extra things that the pitchers have, which are their pitching heat maps, which shows where the pitches end up with each pitch that they throw. So if they throw a changeup in the bottom right-hand corner of the strike zone consistently, that means there's going to be a big red mark in the middle of that zone, which basically means they're just throwing that changeup where they want it to. If it's all over everywhere, that means that they're wild. It's just fun to look at. I like looking at it because I'm a baseball nerd. If you don't, you don't have to look at it. You can also see the movement profile of each of the pitches. Now we're really getting into nerd things because this is how to really understand how good a pitch is in comparison to other pitchers. If a slider has a big time movement profile, that means it's going to be breaking more than other sliders, which means they have a good slider. If you look at somebody like Chris Sale, who has a historically good slider, his movement profile on it is insane because his slider's insane. However, because this video is getting really long, I'm just going to move on to the final website, and that is Fangraphs, because I don't want to keep you here all day. The most important and different thing that is on Fangraphs that I love using the site for is something called splits. Splits are a great way to split up a player's overall stat page to get more information on a specific event. If you want to look up Rafael Devers' stats versus left-handed pitchers compared to righties, this is an easy spot to do it. If you want to see Devers' home and away splits, day and night splits, or what his batting average is in a 1-in-1 count, or what his OPS was in May, or whatever you could possibly be curious about, this is the way to find that information. This is a good way to really start to understand just how good a player is in specific situations. Because of course, some players thrive in certain situations, and this is the best way to find out what those situations are. That's basically all I have for this video. These are the most important stats that I look at when doing any sort of MLB research. I hope you learned a little something from this video, and if you still have questions, please ask. I'll answer to help you guys out. And if you want to use your new baseball stat knowledge, check out this video on the screen on Jarren Duran and how he became an underrated superstar in just 2 seasons.